Have you ever taken a photo like this when what you really wanted was this? Or get a shot like this when what you were actually going for was this? And do you know how to take a photo like this or this? Well, there's a way to do it that's far easier than messing around with full manual mode. It's called shutter priority, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. First, it's great to see all of you again, and if you're new here, I'm James Lavish, and this channel is all about making photography simple. So if that sounds good to you, you're in the right place. Today, we're talking all about shutter priority, and by the end of this video, you'll know exactly how to use it with total confidence. Oh, and I made a free cheat sheet for you, so remember to grab that on your way out. I put a link in the description below. Okay, first, let's talk about camera settings for a bit. If you saw my video about aperture priority, you know there are different modes on most cameras that make it a little bit easier to capture the type of photo you're looking for, far easier than fumbling around with manual mode, especially as a beginner. And if you haven't seen the video on aperture priority, I highly recommend watching it. I'll link that below too, and you can check it out. So shutter priority, what is it meant for? First, and probably the most obvious, is freezing action. A fast shutter speed opens and closes the shutter quickly enough that the image is frozen sharp. So sports, birds in flight, kids playing, anything moving fast that you want to freeze crisp and clear. Also, anything that you want to capture slowly in order to smooth out the image, soften the action, things like waterfalls or rivers, clouds, car lights maybe. So how do you do it? First, you set your camera in shutter priority mode, and on Sony and Nikon cameras, this is denoted by an S, and on Canon, it's a TV. Next, set your camera to auto ISO with the limit at the highest level you feel comfortable with. Usually, this is within the camera's native ISO, which is the range the manufacturer sets that it feels the quality is high enough that the image taken in that range are definitely usable. If you don't know your camera's native ISO, just do a quick Google search specific to your camera. It's pretty easy. And if you want to learn more about ISO, I did a whole video about native ISO, and it goes into some important details about what ISO is and how you should use it. I'll also link that below and you can check it out. Anyway, for this camera, the Sony a7R III, the native ISO tops out at 32,000. Now that's a bit too grainy for my personal taste, so I usually set the limit to 16,000. Next, you choose your shutter speed. For fast action, sports, wildlife, this could be like 800, 1600, even 2500, depending on how fast the subject is moving. And to smooth out moving water, I usually use between half a second and 2 seconds. To smooth out clouds or create car light streaks, this can be as much as 10, 15, or even 30 seconds. For instance, this shot in Disco Bay was 15 seconds. It was just so windy up on the hill, and the water was so choppy that I needed a super long shutter to smooth it all out. And of course, a tripod. Then, after you set your shutter speed, make sure you set your focus and metering to work with each other. And what I mean here is for sports and action, I like to keep focus at the center and also meter the center of the frame. And for landscapes or cityscapes, I use spot focus and spot metering, as this gives me more flexibility. Then, if you find the metering for a scene or an event is consistently coming out too dark or too bright, you can always use the exposure compensation dial to adjust, same as you did with aperture priority. And now that you have your camera ready, it will automatically adjust your ISO and aperture as you take your shot. And what you'll find is that when you're taking action or sports photos, your aperture opens up, sometimes to the widest setting of f2.8 or f4, because the shutter is only open for a fraction of a second, and that lens has to let in more light to compensate. And if it's a dark stadium, you'll find your ISO also begins to bump up. Conversely, if you're shooting a river or a waterfall during midday with bright light and keeping the shutter open for a second or two, you'll find that the aperture closes all the way down, allowing less light into the lens in order to compensate for that shutter being open for so long and letting in all that light. Sometimes the lens closes down to f22 or whatever the highest stop is on that lens, and the ISO pushes all the way down to 100 or even 50, and it's still not enough to compensate for that long shutter. So what do? Well, you can use one of these, an ND filter. And if you've heard the analogy that ND filters are like sunglasses for your camera, that's pretty accurate. See, they give that extra layer of compensation for the long shutter, so now you can capture that waterfall or river or even streaking clouds because you're shielding your lens with the ND filter. They come in all levels of strength, and I like the adjustable ones because they're much easier to use for video. Also, for longer exposures, since your shutter is open for so long, you'll need a tripod to be sure your images are sharp and not affected by camera shake. I tell you what, let's go outside and I'll show you exactly how this works in real life.
Okay, so I went up the street here just to get some shots of moving cars, and I picked a spot where you can see the cars are going to move into the shadows, and this will give us some opportunity to see how the camera reacts to the cars moving in and out of the light. First thing we do is we make sure that we are in autofocus continuous, which we are, and the next thing we do is we check that we have our focus area set to center, and we do, because usually with sports you're trying to center your subject, and that's the best place for you to have your focus area as you're moving the camera so quickly. And because our subject is most important, we want the metering to be on the subject, also at center, which it is. And then we just set our shutter speed, and right now it's at 1/400th, and that might be fast enough to freeze these cars, but we'll see. And one quick check at the histogram, it looks like there's nothing blown out. It's well exposed. However, if we wanted to adjust that, we could use the exposure compensation dial up here, and you can see the f-stop move as I do that. So one full stop changes the f-stop as well, and that moves a stop. So if I wanted to compensate down a stop, the f-stop will close down. So if we leave it at 0 and we're ready. Okay, let's check our shot. Looks like it's a little bit soft, that it could be frozen a little bit better.
Sir, it would be sharper if you used this.
So let's move our shutter speed up to 800. It's a little bit better. And if we move it up to 1600, and that's even better. So looking at the shots, if we go back to the first one, you can see it's at 1/400th shutter speed. F-stop was 5.6, ISO was 100. The next shot was shutter speed 1/800th, F-stop moved to 5.6, ISO was still 100. And that last shot, the shutter speed was 1/1600th of a second, F-stop moved to 3.5, and ISO was still 100. Now the F-stop opened up because we closed down the shutter, and it was open only half as much as the 1/800th and 1/4 as much as 1/400th of a second. So that f-stop had to move down approximately 2 stops to compensate for that. And you can see, as we're in the shadow here at 1/1600th of a second, if I move up to the sky or a brighter area, you'll see that f-stop moves accordingly. Now, if I got into a very dark area, that ISO would begin to move as well. So you can see the ISO is 100, the f-stop is moving around, ISO is still 100. Now when that f-stop gets down to the lowest level, which is 1.8 on this lens, so shielding it with my hand, you can see that that f-stop is now 1.8 and the ISO is moving up as I close it down and let no light in. And that's it. It's as easy as that. So the next time you're out taking action photos of sports or an event and you want to freeze that action, you can just put it into shutter priority and you know exactly what you're doing now. Okay, so let's go see how we do motion blur now.
Okay, here we are back at my super exotic waterfall, and you can see that we're on a tripod and we're ready for our water shot. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is change our focus settings. We will change our autofocus to single, and then the next thing we change is our focus spot. And if you know me and you've seen some of my other videos, then you know that I like to use the flexible spot and medium, and then I can choose where I want to focus, or I could use the little joystick, and that's better for landscapes. And then we want to meter the light to the center of the frame, and typically you want to get a general metering of the scene. As in a landscape, you're really looking mostly at the histogram to determine whether or not you are exposed properly. And there we have our histogram. So the next thing we do is, since this is a waterfall, we want to actually move our shutter speed way down. We'll move it all the way down to, say, 1/2 of a second. You can see that the histogram is blown way out. There's almost nothing on it anymore. Our aperture is all the way up at f/22. Our ISO is down as low as it can go, which is 100. And so what do? Well, remember we talked about putting on an ND filter, and that should help solve this problem. Let's go ahead and get our ND filter out. And you want to do this pretty carefully, especially if you have your scene already set up. So carefully set it in front of the lens and try not to move the lens at all as you are threading the filter onto the lens. That looks good. And since this is a variable ND, right now it's set to 0. As we turn that filter all the way to the right and push it down from 2, 3, 4 to 5 stops. That's 5 full stops that it's shielding the lens of light. You can see that the f-stop moved down all the way down to f16, and now we're within a usable histogram and we can take this shot. So we've got our focus right there, the mini waterfall, and it's ready to go. You know that I like to use a remote so we don't introduce camera shake, especially when we're on a tripod. And you can see that that shutter was a little bit longer. So now if we take this photo and we move in, you can see that those ripples are a little bit less pronounced. And here's a big shot of that. I should note that I have the optical steady shot off because we're on a tripod, and you may have seen in some of my other videos that I like to keep that off when we're on the tripod because it actually will go hunting for camera movement, and the small oscillations will actually introduce camera shake. So I keep that off when I'm on a tripod. And if we wanted to lengthen this exposure to say 1 full second, we're at f22 and it's warning us, but looking at the histogram, it still looks okay. So we're going to try it. Let's see how that looks. And then we'll try one more, 2 full seconds. And yeah, now the histogram is really pushed up to the right there, and that'll probably be blown out. But since this is a full frame camera, we'll try it. And that just means I would need a stronger ND filter to take this type of photo. So we may need like an ND6 or an ND10 in order to shield out enough of that sunlight to make sure that none of this is blown out. And that's it. You can use this on car trails or on clouds or on waterfalls, rivers, moving water. And so anything you want to capture with motion blur, you can use shutter priority for.
See, simple as that. Now you're ready to get out there and snap some killer action or water or car streak shots or anything else you want to freeze or blur with confidence. Oh, and a quick tip, if you're in a super crowded area, yeah, right, remember what that was like? If you want to capture buildings or a cool courtyard and you don't want people in the photo, just put your camera in a tripod or a GorillaPod or whatever and set a long shutter and the people will just vanish. Try it for yourself next time and see what I mean. So what are you going to use shutter priority for? Sports, kids, wildlife? Leave a comment below and let me know. I really want to know what you guys are shooting. Okay, I hope this video helped. If you feel like it did, please hit that like button as that definitely helps. Don't forget to grab your free cheat sheet, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next video.